Welcome to the InfoSec Insider podcast, brought to you by URM, the UK's leading information and cybersecurity specialists.
Hi, my name's Annie and I'm here today with Jack Woods and George Ryan, who are both consultants with us at URM. Welcome to another episode of InfoSec Insider Talk Cyber. So today, Jack and George are going to be talking about what organisations can do to reduce the likelihood of a security breach occurring. So my first question for you guys to kick off our discussion is, we often hear about security breaches, but what actually constitutes a breach?
Great question. So these are really, it could be anything. It could be an attack. It could be accidental disclosure of information. But then in terms of kind of information security breaches, potentially ISO 27001 breaches, it could be people accidentally breaching policy as well. So there's purposeful breaches, and then there's accidental breaches, and that's largely what we would constitute. And then obviously if you talk about kind of personal data, there are reportable breaches to the ICO, and then there are kind of thresholds outlined for what is a reportable breach and things like that, and your reporting mechanisms and timeframes. So yeah, there are a few different variations or thought processes behind a security breach, but those I think are largely the main things that we would be looking at. Do you have anything to add on that, George?
No, I would just say it's absolutely, as you say, it's not just a directed attack on you. There's been examples recently with local councils where it's been as simple as actually uploading a spreadsheet online and not realizing there's a hidden column with personal information. I think we've seen it in the GRC space recently as well. Just someone sending a link, and actually they've had it in the settings that that's anyone with a link can open. Therefore, technically, there's going to be potentially unauthorized access.
And I think as well, sometimes it depends on what an organisation has deemed as a breach. So they may have defined different thresholds for what a breach looks like. So if that information is sent internally, but it's sent to someone who shouldn't have seen it, they may not treat that as seriously as if that information is shared externally to someone that isn't supposed to have seen it, an unauthorized user.
Amazing, thank you guys. So I think you've started to touch on this a little bit, but could you just give me some more details on what is often the cause of a breach? Yeah,
so a breach, usually it's going to be a failure at some point in either your people, so that's the people working for you, it's going to be your processes, what you have procedurally in place, do you check for certain things, or your technology, or even just actually in your supplier. You can have a breach simply through who you've chosen to be your supplier. Usually it is going to be a blend of more than one. So, if we go, for example, one area which could be an issue with your people is that just someone's clicked on a phishing link, they've not really been paying attention, that's happened, that's an error in your people. There could also be the process error there, that actually you have a process when you get external emails, you're not to click links, and actually they fail to follow your process. You could then have the technical element of that, in that actually they've clicked this link, but you thought you had something in place which prevents the opening of malicious links. So your tech has failed at that point. So ultimately, it's never really going to be all on one thing. It can be, obviously. It's more likely to be a blend of each, which is why when we're looking at kind of preventing breaches from happening, we don't just focus on one area. We try to get more of a holistic view of it.
Yeah, and I think that's something that we're seeing quite often at the moment, is those supply chain attacks and the combination of those breaches. So usually it's potentially a person that's accidentally clicked a link or given away their credentials, and that's then led to a breakdown in the supply chain. That supplier or the malicious actor has been able to gain access to your systems via the supplier. So yes, and that's something that we're seeing more and more often these days. I think that's kind of leading to greater levels of due diligence for suppliers.
I guess off the back of that one as well, probably a good example is we'll kind of often see in the news that say a retail company will suffer a ransomware attack and everyone's like, oh my gosh, everyone's after retail companies at the moment. Like, why is everyone suddenly focusing on them and attacking them? And chances are it's actually that a lot of these retailers use the same supplier, and that supplier's been hit, and they've just been hit because they're part of that. Same with your MSP. If your MSP gets hit, you are potentially on the list of those to get a knock-on impact from that.
So it sounds to me like there's a lot to cover and a lot of different angles you can look at it from. So how do businesses even get started?
I would always advise the risk-based approach. There are other approaches, but risk-based approach is probably the best way to go. You can walk through it quite easily with the use of standards. So ISO 27001 is a risk-based standard. And so you use those standards to aid you in identifying the risks to your organization. And then by doing that, you kind of identify where your highest risks are. You can prioritize those. And it may not just be IT. It may be that those risks go on to the people. So awareness. So that's why organizations run phishing campaigns, to ensure that people are aware of what a phishing email looks like, how to report it, those kind of things. But the key thing in conducting risk assessment is identifying the assets. If you don't identify the applicable assets within your organization, it's very difficult to cover all of those bases, because if you don't identify an asset, you can't risk assess it. It's difficult to identify, or it's difficult to assess something that you don't know exists. So that's why we often see, and what we do when conducting risk assessments is we speak to different business units within the organization to make sure we've got a holistic view of the assets that are in scope, and that allows us to work with them to identify what risks would be relevant to them and help them prioritize those.
Yeah, just off the back of that, I'd probably add one of the more recent examples we see is with AI at the moment. So again, a lot of organizations, AI is in use, but they tend not to have an idea of how heavily it is in use. So they might just think they're using Copilot, but actually when we do the interviews, you've got ChatGPT, numerous others. You've got people using AI to record meetings. Like Jack says, if you don't know that's going on, there's no real way that you're going to be able to protect that. You are essentially just shooting into fog. You don't really know what you're doing. And just to add for the frameworks as well, like Jack says, it's a really good one for just giving you that holistic approach, because otherwise you could go online, you could read heavily into cryptography and encryption, spend millions doing, state of the art, and actually you've missed phishing completely.
And I think that's the key thing. Like you've just mentioned, you can spend millions on tools and technology, but it's often people. Unfortunately, it is people that make mistakes. We are human. We make mistakes. And so that's the cheapest investment that you could probably make. It's just increasing that awareness, running those phishing campaigns, annual training or quarterly kind of refresher training, that kind of stuff. It doesn't take too long. And if you build it into the culture of your organization, you often find that those organizations tend to do better in terms of managing their security performance.
So you started talking a bit then about identifying what you have and why that's important. So could you just go into a little bit more detail about how exactly this helps?
Yeah, of course. So from a technical perspective, if we use the example of Intune, which a lot of people use to manage their devices, what that can do is that can allow you to have an oversight of, all the devices that are rolled into your organization, that are being used for organizational activities. Because you have that information, you can actually then start to see software versions they're using. Are they using the latest operating system? Are they compliant with what your organization has? Or actually, do I need to force someone to restart their computer and apply updates? Without having that kind of knowledge, you are reliant on just asking people, have you updated your PC? And, we give a classic example. Someone goes on holiday for 2 weeks, comes back, last thing they're going to want to do is restart the PC, because they've probably got about 100 emails to get through and they just want to do that and they can't. But actually having something technical which has identified it all for you, then actually allows you to take action on what has been identified. So another thing that we have in terms of the identification of what you have is, again, once we know what we have, we can actually look at performing tests on those. So at the lower kind of level of it, we have the vulnerability scanning. So you run your vulnerability scanner across your estate. You know your estate because we've identified what we have. That's going to come back and probably light up like a Christmas tree, tell you, there's high criticals here that need to be addressed urgently. Okay, there's lower stuff here. There's mediums that you should get to that, but let's do the criticals and the highs first. But without actually knowing what you have, it's really hard to do a vulnerability scan because you're potentially not scanning half of the estate. We move it up to a more technical level, and that's when you can have your penetration testing. So it's not just saying this is vulnerable or not, but actually it's here's how it would be exploited. Here's how we've exploited it. Again, what's really good with the penetration testing as well is that can actually help you to further identify what you have. So, for example, pen tester comes in and you've just said to him, look, I roughly know what we have, but I want you to go to town, see what you can discover. Well, actually, what happens a lot of time is a penetration tester will come in and say, actually, you've got a laptop here or you've got a server here, which is running really out-of-date software. Are you aware that was visible? Did you know you had it? And someone will go, oh, actually, I was meant to remove that. I was meant to get rid of that, but I've completely forgotten. So again, these tests can actually help you further identify what you have. And in some ways, it's not even what you have, but it's what an attacker could see you have. Because there's certain things that you have. Let's use the example of engineering. You have an engineering machine which is running on a very outdated Windows system. Often how it works, that's fine. You don't want an attacker to be able to find that and then exploit that and use that for nefarious activities. And again, you're identifying what you have and identifying what you have visible to others.
I think you made a good point as well at the start of that, talking about the tools that could aid you in identifying assets across the organisation as long as those assets are enrolled. I think something that a lot of organisations don't necessarily consider is mobile devices, so mobile phones, tablets. If they are BYOD, bring your own device, it can lead to those kind of outdated softwares and patching and things like that, because you may not necessarily have complete control over that device. So there are ways to manage that. Obviously, you can administer kind of work mobile devices, mobile phones, tablets, but that can be quite costly as well. You could also potentially ask people to enroll their device and have a partition on that device that is specific for work purposes. And there's also kind of like the procedural controls that you could put in place as well. So if you have a policy to say, if you're using bring your own devices, so such as mobile phones, tablets, you need to ensure that they are kind of adhering to X levels of kind of software patching, and the patches are administered within kind of the required timeframes, etc. Because that's often another way that organizations potentially get caught out, is that you've got devices connecting in, and kind of what you were alluding to, George, in terms of you've got these devices that are on your network that you don't necessarily have identified. So that is potentially another way in as well. So that's something else to consider when identifying those assets.
So often for a breach to occur, there needs to be access. So how would you go about managing that access in a way that reduces the likelihood of a breach?
Yeah, so there are a few ways. There's the kind of the procedural route, and then there's the technical route, but I'll talk through the procedural stuff. So induction training at the start of, so when a joiner kind of starts at an organization, having induction training, talking them through what they can and can't access and the reasons for that. There's kind of procedural controls that you'd have in place. So principle of least privilege, defense in depth, that kind of stuff. So you only get access to what you need to have access to complete your role within the organization. If you need further access, that access must be requested, and those requests need to be kind of signed off by your line manager and potentially a technical lead as well, to ensure that that access is being granted for the correct reasons. And they may then put additional access controls on that. So probably something George will lead into, but they could put out they could do a timeout period, so that access is only relevant for 14 days, 30 days, however long they deem fit, or however long that person needs the access for. You can have kind of joiner, mover, leaver procedures in place. So what you often see in organizations is people that have been there for a long time and start in one area of the business and then migrate across the business. That access isn't the access that they started with, isn't always necessarily the access they need to conduct their role currently. And so what you find is that people have legacy access to systems they don't necessarily need, but because that was their role at the start, that access hasn't then been revoked. So having joiner, mover, leaver processes in place to state that if someone moves from, I don't know, IT, for example, into people management, it's a jump. But if they were to move from IT into HR, for example, the access to the information they would have as an IT user, while it's potentially critical to the business, isn't necessarily access that they would need as a HR user. And the same for the other way around. The HR personnel would have access to personally identifiable information, but they wouldn't need access to be able to raise people's privileges within an organization. So having those kind of procedural controls in place allows you to ensure that access is revoked from areas that aren't required and administered in areas that are.
Yeah, some really good points there. A lot of the technicals kind of been covered there. And it's having your stuff like your multi-factor authentication. So it shouldn't just be your username and password that can log you in, but actually want other things. I'm sure everyone gets it. You try log in, your phone's in the other room. You're like, right, I've just got comfy, but actually I need to go to the bedroom, go get my work phone. Maybe you shouldn't leave your work phone in the bedroom. It's a bit weird, but you go there, you get your code, you come back, you can sign it. And sometimes it's a pain, but if it's a pain for you, it's a pain for an attacker, which is what we want. Likewise with the conditional access, does John from accounts really need to be signing in at 2 a.m. from a completely different continent? Or do we want that to automatically raise an alert and ban him because actually we know John's just down the road, so that's probably not John? Likewise, like you said, with the principal least privilege, when an attacker comes in and they've got access, one of the first things they're looking for is, well, actually, how can I get more access? Ultimate goal for them is, I want to be a global admin. I want to have all the power, all the keys. I can run on my tools. I can do this. Like Jack said, simply just giving people only what they need is going to severely limit what an attacker could do were they in your systems. One of the things that can be quite difficult is trying to explain to your IT guys who use their admin account most days is, yeah, that's great, but we need a non-admin account for your daily stuff. Like if you're just browsing the web, you're looking at the news, do we need you to be doing that as an admin? We don't want to hand all the keys over and their account gets popped. It's like, well, that's it. They've got the admin. They can do what they want. Again, with our access, managing it is just making access harder, but not unrealistically hard. Like we don't want our employees to get in front of the screen, do like a 3-minute dance routine, and then they can sign in, because that is not realistic. But we do want to kind of enforce stronger passwords. We want to make sure that it's not, 6 characters, but we're looking at more. We're looking at complex. There's guidance out there. It's managed. It's not reused. Kind of all of those kind of things. Like Jack said, with the person moving, from IT to people. Again, is it having security groups? So you've got role-based access control. That's their role. They can do this. They've now moved. They're now in people. Well, they're just in people. They don't need to be able to access our servers. We don't want that there. we can further it and go for wider access. And that's when we have our things in place, like our firewalls. So we don't want unauthenticated connections. We only want to allow this, this, and this. Again, that's going, okay, we've got a MSP, we've got an IT company. Sometimes they help us out. They remote into our computers. Well, we want it. So yes, they can do it, but other people won't be able to. We don't just want to say to the world, hey, we've got this port open, come connect to us. Because people are scanning all the time. You put a firewall and you put nothing on it and you open up to the world and you'll have a ridiculous amount of scans on there. Equally, in terms of managing access, you can look at using a VPN. So actually, you can't access our organizational data unless you're on the work corporate VPN. And that's creating that encrypted tunnel. So if someone is on the outside, they can't see what you're doing. And, I'm from home, but because I'm on the VPN, it's as if I'm in the office. And ultimately, we're having the GRC, we're having the technical orders, we're just really controlling who can access, what they can access, and not just giving it up for anyone who just wants to put in a username and password.
Amazing. Thank you, guys. So obviously these days, a lot of data is held in the cloud. It's all about the cloud. But how does that impact the likelihood of a breach?
Yeah, so I think one of the big things with the cloud that we often forget is it's just an extension of your landscape as such. They hold your data. That's fine. That means our security needs to extend to that cloud. We can't just go, well, we use this cloud service. It's all safe with them. It's fine. We don't need to do anything. Depending on what you have, because you've got IaaS, PaaS, SaaS, so infrastructure as a service, platform as a service, software as a service. A lot of people are going to fall into software as a service. Depending which one you have, actually depends on what you need to be doing in place in terms of security. So if you've got infrastructure as a service, so you might have Amazon Web Service, well, actually, you are going to be kind of responsible for some of the things that you're doing there. The servers you're using, how you're controlling access to it, how you're virtualizing, storage, etc. You move to platform as a service, and you've got a few more things that are responsible for the cloud provider rather than you, but still the applications you're running and the data, that's for you. And then we've got our software as a service, and people say, well, we use Microsoft 365, so therefore we're secure, they do everything. And it's not the case, because if they did everything, then why would you use them? Because you wouldn't have anything to put there because everything's done by them. But you're still responsible actually for the accounts you create, the accounts you remove, who you make as an admin, how you are controlling access. Within that, actually how you are, for example, making sure not everyone can view everything in SharePoint. If I'm in IT, I probably don't need to access what HR has access to. You don't want everyone just going straight to HR, straight to seeing what everyone's paid, and then email and say, why am I paid this much? They're paid this much. You've still got responsibility ultimately. You can't just fully get rid of it. You are still going to have some. You are probably going to want to look at stuff such as what you have contractually with your cloud service provider. Again, are they to notify you if there's a breach, or is that something you have to do yourself? Equal to that is actually when you exit, what happens? Do they delete your data, or does it just stay there infinitely until they decide to just randomly get rid of it? Your data is still there. You still have responsibility for it. So it's still one of those that actually you'd still need to do stuff.
Yeah, I think that's where a lot of people get confused about the kind of the shared responsibility model that is actually in place. A lot of people within organizations often look at it and say, oh, well, we've outsourced that, so it's fine. And like George has alluded to, that's not necessarily the case. The cloud service provider is usually kind of responsible for those physical security aspects of data centers, securing kind of the foundational infrastructure that George was talking about. But then the actual kind of configuration of that infrastructure within the system, and the patching and the access, the user access is all on you. So you can't then go back to them and say, oh, well, hold on a minute, this person's been granted access, because they have no control over that. They can only access a slip of what you're doing. And like George mentioned as well about the contracts, there are more and more contracts these days that are looking at the notification requirements. So what priority would I be in terms of recovery situations? Because like we've talked about, if you are largely cloud-based, generally that information is replicated across regions, so that in the event of an incident, you have backups of that information and you can get back to what you need to be doing fairly quickly. But more and more often, when looking at due diligence questionnaires now, you find questioning around, well, what level of priority would I receive in terms of restoration of that service, and what is the threshold for me to be notified as the customer. So yeah, that's something that you definitely need to look at, and the exit clauses as well, especially if you're an organization certified to ISO 27001. Part of, I say new, when it came out in 2022, it was new. One of the new controls was, I think it's 5.23, information security for use of cloud services. And that requires you to have processes for acquisition, use, management, and exit from those cloud services. So yes, again, it's having those clauses to say, well, in the event that we do leave, they may offer to help with the migration of that data. They probably wouldn't, but they may do. And if they aren't going to do that, when you do leave, you need to be kind of confident that that data has either been returned to you or destroyed, so that no one then can access it post your relationship with that supplier. Via them anyway. If someone then gets unauthorized access internally in your system, then they could still access it, obviously.
Yeah, amazing. It's not just about what you've got in place while you're with them. It's also about having that plan for when you're not with them anymore.
Yeah, exactly.
Perfect. Amazing. So you briefly mentioned suppliers. Could you just talk us through what the risk is with the supply chain, sort of how that creates security risks, and I guess also what can be done to mitigate those risks as well?
Yeah, of course. So I think we touched on it a little bit earlier in terms of the ways that a breach can occur, and it usually falling on kind of a failure of people or the suppliers or technology or processes, and that's largely what the risk is with the supply chain. It's that you can only know up to the image that they've given you what their security posture is like. They have to. So the way that organizations manage this generally is with due diligence questionnaires, third-party risk management. So they often in these due diligence questionnaires, there's a kind of disclaimer at the end that says, have you answered this questionnaire to the best of your knowledge and ability, to kind of say, well, this person answering the questionnaire will only know the answers. They know more than we do. But what you can do, and what I've seen organizations do, especially with cloud services, is often those cloud services wouldn't necessarily respond to a due diligence questionnaire, especially big services, and big suppliers don't necessarily respond to those questionnaires either. So your Amazons and Microsofts, if your little one-man band organization were to send them a supplier due diligence questionnaire, it probably wouldn't even get into their mailbox. So you then have to take it on the basis of those organizations often have a page on their website, like a security hub, that outlines what they do and how they keep your data secure, etc. But yeah, like I say, the other means of doing that is those supplier due diligence questionnaires, and you would then cover kind of the level of access they have data to, So whether that's personal information, just general business information, or public information. So for example, a marketing organization may be given access to information that's going to be public anyway. So the impact, should there be a breach of that information that's with that supplier, will be lower than the impact of if there's a breach with your HR tool provider. So if you're using a provider such as kind of Breathe HR or any of those other tools, the information on there is going to be personally identifiable information, is going to have a much larger impact on an organization than if it were that marketing organization that suffered the breach. And you have to be realistic as well in terms of those due diligence questionnaires, because if they are a smaller organization, the level of kind of security controls they may have may be a lot different to your Amazons and your Microsofts, because they don't necessarily have the funding to be able to meet those requirements. So that's something that you need to kind of consider when looking at supply chain risk, is that level of due diligence that you can actually do, and where you can't have a questionnaire looking at their kind of security hub or any kind of security page that organization might have to get those answers, essentially.
I think just off the back of what Jack said, especially with the new AI stuff being the popular thing, have a look at their privacy policy as well. See if you are being used for training. We've had it before where we've been speaking to a client and they've said, what do you think about this AI tool that we're using for recording meetings? And you go to the privacy policy page, and one of the first things it says is that they are going to use it for training, which probably don't want.
Yeah, especially if you're recording those potentially highly confidential meetings with that kind of AI tool. You don't necessarily want that being used to train the tool.
Thanks, guys. So again, you've mentioned monitoring. What kind of actions can be taken in relation to that?
Yeah, so one of the big things with obviously your monitoring is you want to be having a watch over what's happening. You want some oversight over what's going on, and that could be stuff such as configuring logging. So events such as people logging on, logging off, powering on, powering off, changing group policies, login locations. You want to have that logged somewhere, because once you have it logged, you can actually configure alerts. So earlier we mentioned the example of John that logs in at 2 a.m. from a different continent. Well, if you have things such as your alerts on, then that's going to flag up red straight away. Potentially you've already got it, so it's just going to block that attempt. But you can actually see that's happened. That then gives you something to look into. Again, like with your DLP, your data loss prevention, having policies in there such as those that would prevent someone sending credit card details. Because you have your DLP in place, someone goes to email a credit card number, which they shouldn't be doing, your DLP flags up. You've effectively monitored it there because it's gone, whoa, hang on, someone's actually tried to do this. Okay, we prevented this. That then gives you something to go on, because it might be that you've caught that, you then look into where that's happening, and the trail leads to more stuff going on. Equally, you want to put things in place such as on your network and configuring of your firewall to see if you've got lots of data going out. Again, you want to keep a monitor of that, because you want to know what's going on here. If 2 gigs of data have gone at, again, 3 a.m. in the morning, you don't have any monitoring in place, you might not know until you're told. And we see that with a lot of organizations that actually they're not aware they had a breach until months later, when they get an email saying, you've been breached, we've been in your systems for this amount of time, I think it's time you pay up. But actually, by having our alerts on, having our logs, our DLP, actually having oversight of our network, whether that's through our firewall, we actually use network intrusion, detecting systems, etc. you can actually start to see a breach live as it's happening. So you can have a proactive response rather than your reactive, which is, Monday morning, oh, yeah, we've been breached. This isn't good. Yeah, a lot of organizations might say, well, that's too complex for us. We don't have the facilities for that. We don't have people that can do that. You can outsource your monitoring as well. So, for example, some people may use a SOC, which is a security operations center, and they'll do that for you. They'll alert you when something's going on. They'll manage it. They'll look over stuff. It might be that your MSP can offer that as well. So again, this isn't just things that you have to do, and you don't have to be, on Google going, well, do I want, network intrusion, or do I want prevention, or do I want this acronym or this acronym? It can be outsourced. I know we've covered the supply chain. We're not saying don't use your supply chain. We're just saying be diligent about your supply chain. Further to that, you've got your threat intelligence. So, what's going on in the news? What do you need to be aware of? If we're seeing that one of our suppliers has been hit, okay, well, we need to be kind of red alert here because this might put us on the radar, so to speak. Again, it's stuff like there's a well-known website, Have I Been Pwned? And you can use that actually to see if any of your credentials have been breached. Have they appeared in a data leak? So there's lots you can do to monitor, and ultimately it's not necessarily just you that has to do this. You can outsource this.
I think just to kind of build on from that as well, I think what you mentioned about kind of impossible travel. So that person that we know actually lives 5 minutes from the office is somehow logging in from, I don't know, Mexico at 3 a.m. And I think you spoke about it could obviously block that. I think one of the key things that needs to be considered as well is that you can only manage a breach if it's reported, and that's the key kind of issue. A lot of people within organizations might feel scared to say, actually I've been phished, or I accidentally clicked a link and it's come up with this kind of virus page, or it wouldn't do that because it would want to be more covert than that probably. But you're only as good at dealing with a breach as you are in reporting them. And you need to create a culture within the organization that is actually, you need to report everything. And if it's kind of false positive, or if it's actually legitimate, the IT team can come back to you and say, actually, no, this is fine. But it's better to have too much reporting than too little, because you're then potentially opening yourself up to those issues of, this breach happened, someone was phished, and kind of 3 months ago they never reported it, and then the people that did it come to you 3 months later saying, we've been in your system for 3 months, this is the data we've collected, we want X amount of money. But if that person reports it immediately, the IT team would potentially be able to kind of lock that device down, lock the account, and then it might be a bit of an inconvenience in terms of the business and you being able to work. They may need to set up a new laptop and create new credentials for you, but that's a lot less cost of time and money than it would be for paying a ransomware attack.
And I think that's why it's so important to encourage people to report things they think are suspicious, rather than having being scared in case they're going to get in trouble or something. People need to know that it's okay, and that's what they should be doing. Amazing. So for the most part, we've been talking about reducing the likelihood of a breach. Do you ever get to a point where there is zero chance of a breach happening, there's no likelihood, or is there always going to be some sort of residual likelihood, some sort of residual risk?
So the only way that you could stop the likelihood from occurring as if you were to cease doing that activity, because then if there's no asset, there's no likelihood and therefore no impact. So it's a bit of a triangle, really. So if you think of the asset at the top, that asset will have a likelihood and an impact in the bottom left and bottom right. If you are to remove the asset, there's no impact or likelihood. You wouldn't necessarily want to do that, because if that's your kind of your business model and you need to be doing this activity to get money, then you're not going to want to just cease doing that activity. So the only way it can be zero is if you stop doing it. Beyond that, if you continue to do it, obviously there are controls, and then those controls will always usually be within, depending on the model you use for likelihood and impact. URM, we use a Brisker as our risk management tool, and that tool has a 1 to 5 model for impact and likelihood. So it's a 5x5 matrix. So there will always be some level of likelihood. It's never zero if you're continuing to do the activity, because, like we've mentioned, there are often ways that things can happen. So people failure, technology failure, supplier failure. You want to reduce likelihood as much as you can, because the impact value of on the organization is generally more difficult to reduce. If you take the example of your HR platform, there's going to be a lot of, or your payroll platform, there's going to be a lot of personal data on there. There's going to be a lot of payment information, bank details, that kind of stuff. The impact, should there be a breach, will always be very high. It could be kind of your whether you kind of determine it as catastrophic or very serious, it will always be high. And that will remain high. There's no controls that you could put in place to reduce the impact of if that information was breached. But what you can do is reduce the likelihood of that breach. So you can add kind of security controls, technical controls. You can encrypt all of that data. And George will be able to talk more about the kind of technical aspect of what you could do to protect that, but you can have the procedural controls in place to say, actually, we need like a 4 eyes function, so it needs 2 people to sign off if there's a change of payment details or a payment address or that kind of thing. But in short, to cut a long story short, the answer is generally the likelihood can never be zero unless you stop doing that activity.
Yeah, no, absolutely agreed with you there. And like you say, with the impact, isn't it? It's, the payroll we're worried about, potentially the work lunch menu, less so. So we're probably not going to invest in protecting that unless we're really into our food. Probably not. So like we say, when we're looking at reducing this risk, it is, what is our biggest risk? I would argue, even though it's not the technical answer, one of the biggest risks that until AI takes over the world that we all have is that we have people in our organization. So, no matter what you have, what you do in place, person Y still needs to access at X. That means because they can access it, if someone gets access to them or what they're doing, they're going to have access to it. So we still want to invest in our people. One of the first things, and again, thankfully, investing in your people isn't the most expensive option. It's not going to cost millions unless you have millions of people. But, you've got your training, getting that secure culture. Like we said earlier with the reporting, we're not paying out massively for a reporting function if we're just reminding our people, please do report things if you think they're suspicious. Obviously, it's best to have the two. The people side of the reporting, that function, that's not costing us loads. We've already got the people there. It's just a case of reminding them to report, if something's suspicious, if they've accidentally clicked something. They could click a document and they sit there for 2 minutes and they go, that's not loaded, that's not done anything. I should probably tell IT something might be up there. Again, we've got our other cheap little wins. It doesn't all have to be expensive. We're not all, £1 billion budgets, unfortunately. So you make do with what you can. Again, this is having stuff like our multi-factor authentication in place. Someone's just gone from signing in with a username and password. We've just now made it that actually they need that and this thing as well. For an attacker, you're thinking, more effort, not ideal for them. Again, we've got our data loss prevention, data leak prevention, having the policies in place for that. If we're, for example, using Microsoft Office 365, which many of you will be, that's got the function to allow you to do that. It's nice and easy to do. Again, when it comes to our encryption, in terms of our emails, using TLS 1.2, 1.3, which is kind of the given encryption standard for those. Outlook example, they support that. Sometimes it is just a case of finding the little tick option to make sure that it is ticked. Again, we've got our device management. One of the first things we can do is actually get all our devices, get them in one kind of management portal, and then we can actually do stuff. We have oversight. We can make sure they're not using anything that is risky, outdated, going to make the likelihood of a breach higher. We've got our firewalls. Let's get firewall set up. They don't have to be hardware ones. You get software firewalls on Windows. Set that up. Let's prevent what can come in. Let's prevent what can go out. Let's have something in place potentially so we can see if there is something suspicious happening there. Again, a lot of the big providers are going to offer this as part of their services. Jack mentioned it earlier. We've got the trust centers where we can check they do this. If we take Microsoft Office 365, Google Workspace, Amazon, they've actually got guidance documents for how you do this stuff, how you can secure your kind of landscape. You don't have to just go in blindly and, read 500 pages. It's going to be quick ways. I'm pretty sure we have stuff on our blogs which will help you do that. That's free, that's available. The webinars, again, just off the back of the webinars, that can help you reduce the breach if you're keeping up to date with what's going on. I would say you can take the less effort way. We put all the effort into learning this stuff, to putting it on a webinar. Just sit back, watch it with a cup of tea, pick up some notes, learn. It's not too bad for you. Again, with our breaches, it's how are we backed up? We want to make sure we're encrypting. So for some, it's AES 256, which is the standard. And you might be going, well, I'm not going to know off the top of my head. That's fine. Just look at who you're using. They will often have it there for which they use, which will be often followed by, we use industry leading encryption, etc. It's all there for you. Most of this is going to be covered. It's just a case of finding out how to actually tick to put it on. That was often the case with the MFA mentioned earlier. A lot of people had it available. They just didn't actually know how to enable it, enforce it. So ultimately, when we are looking at reducing our risks, there's lots of things that we can do. A lot of the main ones aren't actually that expensive and they're pretty easy to implement. We don't have to be going on a custom configuration that requires us to get specialists in and do this and that. And actually, no, a lot of it is there for you. It's just a case of having a quick guide, knowing what to do. All I'd add to that as well is it's good to get a snapshot of where you are at now. So again, with your vulnerability scans, your penetration testing, find out where you are now. For example, when we do our penetration testing, we can say, we've tested you. Here's where you're weakest. Here's what you need to prioritize. And actually you'll go, okay, great. You've just done the hard bit for me. I just know what I need to know now. I need to know where I can feed back. Again, you've got 3 examples of things. So NCSC, as the National Cybersecurity Centre, they will do a free domain check for you on your email to see if you've got things set up fine from a technical perspective. That's free to do. The CISA, so the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure in America, which is government run. That has things for checking your cloud. It's called Scuba. So that, have I been pwned again? That will tell you if there's been a breach. You can put your email in. You can actually check where you stand right now. Because you might put that in and go, oh my gosh, actually, we featured a breach here. Right, let's change that straight away. So there's lots there. There's lots that's free. And you don't need to reinvent the wheel. The wheel's there. It's just a case of you finding it and then just rolling it, and it will do most of it itself.
Amazing. Thank you so much, you guys. We've covered a lot there. It's been a very broad podcast episode, but I think it is a big topic. So for any of our listeners that would like to ask Jack and George a question, we've got a link in the description of this episode, which will take you to a form on our website. So you can fill that out with your question, or you can just leave it in the comments of this video. We've also got a blog on our website, urmconsulting.com, that you can check out, which sort of covers this topic, goes into a little bit more detail as well in other areas, and that's called Strengthening Your Cyber Defences, Practical Steps for Every Business. So do go and give that a read, and thank you very much for listening today. If you've enjoyed this podcast, we would really appreciate it if you could spare a moment to leave a rating or review at ratethispodcast.com/InfoSec Insider. To listen to more episodes, you can find us on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, YouTube, and Podbean.
Thank you for listening to URM's InfoSec Insider podcast. For more information, visit our website at urmconsulting.com.